What's up, everyone? Welcome back to DodgerHeads, presented by DodgerBlue.com, your home for all things Dodgers. My name is Jeff Spiegel. Tonight, I am joined once again by Justin Lorber, a.k.a. the man behind Future Dodgers on social media, FutureDodgers.com. And we are back for part 2 of the prospect extravaganza. So, Justin, thanks for joining us. I know you're an Indiana guy. You're kind of a Big Ten guy. Brad Stevens, not necessarily the ideal week for you. So before we get started with Dodger stuff, I just want to make sure you are doing okay.
We're doing great. We're not involved in whatever tournament shenanigans the Big Ten seems to put on every year. So we're doing great. We're just looking for a new coach. If anyone's interested, I would encourage them to contact the athletic department.
There you go. Well, hey, I'm an Oregon fan. We got a big win this morning. Dana Altman is not allowed to go anywhere. That man is a legend as far as I'm concerned. So, hey, we appreciate you guys joining us. I know the Dodgers are playing spring training. We do have a blowout. USC looks to be beating Kansas. They're blowing them out right now. So the folks that are joining us on YouTube, on Facebook, on Periscope, we appreciate you guys joining us. And again, we're going to talk about something more enjoyable than Big Ten basketball tonight, I can assure you that, which is the Dodger farm system, something that is loaded with prospects, something, Justin, you are very familiar with. And folks that are joining us, if you missed last week's show, after tonight, do yourself a favor, go back and watch it. Justin and I broke down the top 10 in his newly released Top 100 Dodger Prospects. You can find that at FutureDodgers.com, and then the video is on our YouTube. But tonight we're going to turn our attention kind of, I wouldn't say to the second tier, but outside of the top 10 prospects in the Dodger farm system, primarily 11 through 30. We'll also spend some time for 31 through 100 for the maniacs that keep track of the guys that live outside of the top 30. I try my best, but honestly, Justin, you could throw some fake names in there after number 30, and a guy like me, I can assure you, would not necessarily know. So the beauty of those guys, though, is that's the next Zach McKinstry, the next Ryan Pepio, some guys who have jumped from that level. So here's the plan for tonight. We're going to do some spring training stuff at the end. Stock up, stock down, big deal, no deal. We got David Price conversation. Does he want to be a relief pitcher? Is Clayton Kershaw's velocity an issue? Cody Bellinger has decided yet again to change his batting stance. And most importantly, as far as I'm concerned, the possibility of Will Smith playing just 90 games for the Dodgers this season. But before we get to any of that, we're going to start with the prospects. As usual, if you're joining us on YouTube, Facebook, or Periscope, be sure to leave a comment. Let us know questions. We're going to be getting to those throughout the show. So if you've got questions for Justin or anything we talk about, please throw it in there. So let's start with the prospects. We did prospects number 1 through 10 in the Dodger system last week, Justin. Let's start with number 11. I'll throw up the list of 11 through 20 here. And I'll just run through it. Clayton Beater at 11, Jacob Amaya at 12, Miguel Vargas at 13, Sheldon Noisy at 14, Michael Grove at 15, Luis Rodriguez at 16, Alex Dejesus at 17, Andre Jackson at 18, Omar Estevez at 19, and Mitch White, number 20. We've got 3 former second-round picks in Beater, Grove, and White. We've got 4 international free agents in Vargas, Rodriguez, Dejesus, Estevez. And then you've got Andre Jackson and Amaya, who are kind of the late-round guys. Sheldon Noisy, of course, came over in the trade with the A's. And so let me start by asking a couple guys on here, names on here that catch my attention. 2 names that jump out to me are Grove and Jackson. If folks are following the channel, they know I got a chance to sit down with Grove, the former second-round pick, who said last year was the first time basically he's been healthy since he's been a part of the Dodgers organization. Of course, he got healthy, and that was all behind closed doors. He had pitched 1 inning early on that was really good. He got a couple innings the other day. He's looked pretty good. To me, it seems like, Justin, he's sort of a sleeper in this group, a guy who it feels like could be a lot higher 6 to 12 months from now. Is that what you see in Michael Grove sitting at number 15?
Yes, and before I go into it, you can see me, right? Because
Yes.
I can't see you or the layout of the screen right now.
Yep, we're good. I'll make sure you can see us. So go for it. Michael Grove, 6 to 12 months from now, is he a guy who's a little bit higher up on the list in your estimation?
Yes. So last year we got a report that his velocity was up in spring training, and this was, of course, before the shutdown. And Baseball America reported that one Dodgers, front office minor league person believed that he would be their best pitching prospect in the year. Obviously, the pandemic happened. You'd have guys like Josiah Gray still in the system, but Michael Grove, I think the upside's there for him to be a solid mid-rotation starter. He comes with a very vertical, over-the-top delivery, but helps his fastball play at the top of the zone. We've seen that in some of the spring games he's gotten into. He's able to get whiffs up and above the zone with his fastball. And he was primarily his outpitch in college was primarily his slider. Okay. Since then, he has developed a curveball that has become, at least from our viewings in spring training, his primary secondary offering. So you combine the slider that was his out pitch as a collegiate pitcher, which is what got him drafted in the second round, usable fastball that gets whiffs in and above the zone, and his new curveball, that's a guy who can start.
Yeah, it felt like when I was talking to him, he described the 2019 season, which was his first back. Of course, he was drafted in 2018, missed the entire season with Tommy John. 2019, he's there. He described it as, I basically had a 92-mile-an-hour fastball, and that was about it, having not pitched in 2 years. And so it's got to be tough because on the flip side, as a guy who evaluates prospects, I mean, there's only so much you know. They're not necessarily broadcasting like, hey, Michael Grove only has a 92-mile-an-hour fastball, and that's it. You're looking at numbers. You're looking at video. It doesn't look good. And so it's kind of encouraging, I guess, for a guy who's a second-rounder who maybe expectations dropped after 2019. It does feel like 2020, 2021, what we've seen so far, he's on the right direction there. The other guy in a similar boat is Andre Jackson. He's ranked as high as number 7 in the organization, according to the Athletic and Baseball Prospectus. MLB Pipeline has him number 29. It feels like there's some Josiah Gray vibes here a little bit. He's older, but he is a converted position player. He's 24 years old. But again, another guy that we get a chance to see in spring training, and Andre Jackson has looked really, really impressive.
Yes, he has. And number one thing that I think has impressed me most is how comfortable he is with his changeup. From all the scouting reports that I've read from some of these major sites, before the draft and in the last several years, his changeup is not generally described as his best out pitch, but he's used that as his primary secondary pitch off of his fastball. He's gotten a few whiffs, gotten a few strikeouts with it. And if that continues to develop, if his slider, if his fastball, mid-90s velocity can get whiffs in the zone. And you mentioned it yourself. This is a converted position player, a guy who has not been pitching for as long as most pitching prospects. So he still has a lot of room to grow despite his age.
Yeah. Also best hair in the organization as far as I'm concerned. No offense to Dustin May. Josiah Gray, who's his best friend, does agree with me on that. But Andre Jackson, some elite level here. Well, before we go to sort of an overview of this group, a couple questions we did get on Twitter for some folks. The first one was about Vargas. He's a 21-year-old corner infielder. I think in your projections, you have him probably as a double-A level player. Hasn't really ever hit for power, if I'm not mistaken. So are you kind of projecting to have him 13? Is there a projection that, hey, the Dodgers just sort of figure this type of thing out, and so he'll be okay?
So Miguel Vargas is the type of player who, with the Dodgers, typically grows into power. He's been such a good hitter at pretty much every minor league stop. If you go into his FanGraphs or MILB page and you look at his stat line from the Midwest League in 2019 as a teenager, a lot of guys have trouble there, especially early in the season, cold weather up in Michigan. But he and Jacob Amaya both excelled, and like I said, he's hit at every stop. And the only question is really his power. Being a corner bat, third base, maybe first base, this is a guy who's going to need to hit for power to provide value, because first baseman or third baseman don't hit 10 home runs and usually are not above average players when they do that. So can he grow into power? I think so. We've seen how many times the Dodgers have done it with similar players. So maybe I'm a little too low on him because, you put a decent likelihood of that power eventually emerging given his age, but someone to watch for sure. Like I said, defensively limited, probably to third or first base. I know we got a little bit of time at second base during 2019, but very likely a corner infield bat.
Just sort of big picture, as I hear you say that, what's the most difficult thing to project onto a player? I know that's a random question, but we sort of talk about well, will this guy ever figure out how to hit? It feels like you can look at a guy's size and you could say, he'll figure it out. The Dodgers will figure this out. Whereas maybe bat control, maybe the ability to just sort of the overall hit tool, not power related, maybe is more difficult to project. I don't know if that question makes sense, but let's talk specifically about hitters. Is power the easiest thing to project, or how do you see that sort of thing shaking out when you make, because a lot of this is guesswork, right? You're looking at a guy like Vargas and saying, I'm basing this on where I think he's going to get to. So how do you sort of navigate all that?
Yeah. So as I always say, it's all subjective. Person to person, outlet to outlet, it's all subjective. You try to project objectivity and leave bias out of it, but at the end of the day, it's a subjective exercise, just like any kind of ranking of anything else. So projecting power. Obviously, when you have guys who look like, say, DJ Peters, you can look at them and say, he's going to hit for power. That's just on the basis of their
Yeah.
size. If he hits the ball, it's probably going to go pretty far. With smaller guys, like say, Jacob Amaya, a guy who typically has in the past more of a line drive swing, a guy who isn't really looking to sell out for power.
Yeah.
Those guys are kind of harder. But it depends on the swing. It depends on the individual player. You might say this guy has great pitch recognition. So when he grows into his body, he's going to be able to drive balls further. So you might be able to project power onto a younger player with a great approach.
Got it.
And it does vary person to person because you can have a 6'2" guy with a very skinny frame who might not grow into a ton of power. You can have a 6'2" guy who's skinny now but has a wide frame, and you can project power onto that. So it does vary person to person, but with the way we're moving in today's game, a lot of guys are trying to hit for power, or at least trying to hit for some power. So it's a little easier to say, yeah, this guy will grow into something.
Yeah, it's interesting. I read the Mookie Betts piece that was in GQ magazine, I believe. And just, I mean, being reminded of his story. I mean, this is a guy who he's what, 5'9", 5'10". I mean, not a big guy. He's not particularly large, like in any sense of the word. And yet, so when you talk about him as a second baseman, they're like, this guy's never going to hit for power. And yet he goes on and figures it out. So it's just an interesting piece. Before we get to sort of you walking through all the list, one other question. This is from Kobe Gigi Forever One on Twitter. Luis Rodriguez, she notes that he's kind of dropped a little bit in the rankings. I don't know if he's dropped in your rankings. Maybe she's referring to rankings in general. But where Rodriguez stands, is that due to his lack of development, or is that more so that other guys in the organization have just passed him by, would you say?
So he's someone who is probably at the top of the list of the guys most hurt by the year off, because he signed last year, or actually now almost 2 years ago. And last year would have been his first full minor league season. He probably would have started in the DSL, would have moved up to the Arizona Summer League if he had done well enough, just like Diego Tartaya and Alex Dejesus, who Alex Dejesus is right behind him on that list. Didn't get that chance. Now he's a year older, still hasn't played a game of professional baseball, even though he's been training with the Dodgers. And additionally, Baseball America had reported that the Dodgers were a little bit worried with his approach. He was getting a little bit too pull happy. Now, he's still an 18-year-old, so it's not a big thing to worry about, but it's minor things like that.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't say that, he hasn't done anything to cause him to fall in rankings. It is, he didn't get included at the alt site. He wasn't a part of the Dodgers in-stretch roster. So there just haven't been too many eyes on him, and he's been passed by some other guys.
Yeah. Okay. Well, before we move on to 21 through 30, we picked off a few of these guys. Why don't you walk us through, starting with Clayton Beater, and just give us kind of the 20, 30-second scouting report on some of these guys? Because, I mean, you might say, top 11, top 11th, 20th, like, do we really care? I mean, in the Dodger organization, the guys on this list that you're looking at, like, we have some guys who are going to be major league contributors this year, and we have a bunch of other guys who are like have a very high ceiling long term. So starting with Beater, give me the 20 to 30 second rundown on some of these guys.
Clayton Beater, one of the Dodgers' 2 second-round picks last year. Ton of upside if he can stay healthy. Great fastball, great power curveball. Someone who, if he can't cut it as a starter, you can throw him in high leverage relief and he can succeed with those two pitches. But if he can develop his third pitch, if he can throw enough strikes, and if he can stay healthy, he has a lot of upside as a starter. Jacob Amaya, someone who I mentioned last week, doesn't have a standout tool, no big power. He's not an 80 grade runner, but he does everything well, everything average to above average. And he's someone who, guys like him a lot of times become greater than the sum of their parts. So a guy who I think has a very high probability of at least being a major league bench bat, a utility infielder with the chance for more.
Is that like would you describe him sort of, I'm trying to think of a Dodger comp that would maybe make sense. I mean, is it like a Cesar is tourist type comp where it's sort of like he's going to hit a little bit, not a ton of power, probably not a major contributor on like a World Series champion team as far as a starter, but I just, when you say he does everything well, I think of his Turris. He could run, he could hit, not really any power. Obviously, he was an elite fielder. Is Turris a good comp? Is there somebody else that kind of would be somebody to put a name on that would make sense for some folks?
So his Turris, I think, ran a little bit, probably more than Amaya would. The other thing with Amaya that I like is he has great pitch recognition. He sees a ton of pitches, he walks a bunch, and just like I mentioned, guys who, do everything well are a lot of times greater than the sum of their parts. Guys who have great approaches at the plate, great pitch recognition, often exceed what their natural tools are.
Got it.
So I think he's going to be very likely a major leaguer. The question is just what his role is.
Got it. Okay.
Sheldon Noisy, a lot of question marks here,
including
26.
Pronunciation of the last name. That's a hard one that I butchered at the time of the trade. How we get Noisy out of that? I mean, I apologize to him for mispronouncing his name, but I feel like that has to be part of the scouting report, in my opinion.
So he has, obviously, we've seen his arm at third base in spring training. Got an absolute rocket. He's played third. He's played second. He's played a little bit of corner outfield. He was a high school shortstop, and they've said that they can throw him there in a pinch if need be. But very likely third baseman, second baseman. The thing for him, he's already hit the ball hard. He hits the ball hard, but he doesn't pull the ball enough, and he doesn't pull the ball enough in the air. And we know balls pulled in the air have the highest value because those are the balls that are typically home runs. So if the Dodgers can help him lift the ball, pull side more, he can hit the ball hard, but it'll go for more value than an opposite field single.
Got it.
Talked about Grove, talked about Elrod. Alex Dejesus is a big sleeper. He was signed as part of the Diego Cartaya class. He actually came with Cartaya from the Dominican Summer League to the Arizona Summer League during the summer of 2019. And he did really well as one of the youngest players in that league. And someone who scouts thought he was going to have to move off of shortstop immediately when he entered pro ball, but he's gotten more athletic. He's gotten more agile. You can maybe project second base, shortstop onto him. Still probably not a shortstop, but maybe a second baseman, which raises his value because guys who can play middle infield are more valuable than guys who can only play corner infield.
Got it.
Talked about Andre Jackson. Omar Estevez is someone who I've been high on for a while. The Dodgers neglected to protect him from the Rule 5 draft by adding him to the 40-man this past offseason, and then he went unselected. So that leaves me to believe, just based on reading the tea leaves, if the Dodgers didn't think he was worthy of addition and other teams didn't want to take a chance on him, maybe I was a little too irrationally high on him. This is still a guy who is younger than the Dodgers' 2 first-round picks from 2019, Cody Hosey and Michael Busch. He's already had a solid year at Double-A. That was in 2019, someone who would have seen Triple-A last year. And he knows how to drive the ball. He knows how to lift the ball. And he hasn't had it show up a ton in games, but I think this is someone who can be either a bench bat or an offensive-oriented second baseman in the future. And we briefly touched on Mitch White last year, someone who has dealt with inconsistencies, dealt with injuries. He's flashed, mid-rotation starter upside at times. What we've seen from him lately is a guy who's probably left in middle relief, at least with the Dodgers, with all the depth that they have. We've heard he's getting healthy, which is good because he just got to see the field and prove he's deserving of a 40-man spot and a 26-man roster spot.
Yeah, it's tough with him. I mean, he's not even going to pitch this spring. I think he had a quote saying, "Yeah, I think I'm going to," and then Dave Roberts came right after him and was like, "Yeah, he's not going to be ready at any point in spring training." He was dealing with like not a shoulder thing, it was like a back shoulder thing, something weird. But yeah, I mean, he basically said, "I'm a relief pitcher at this point in this organization because of who the Dodgers are and where the needs are." He's like, I'm ready to go as a relief pitcher. So it'll be interesting to see, he's a guy who's on the 40-man roster. So does he get a chance to do anything? So let's move to 21 through 30. We'll do things the opposite way because I think this will make more sense. I'll throw the list up here. Why don't you walk us through to start? Why don't you go through each of the lists of the guy doing the same sort of thing? And then there's a couple guys that I can follow up with some questions on. But starting with Landon Knack, another 2020 draft pick. Walk us through 21 through 30.
Landon Knack, another guy that we touched on last week, one of the 2 Dodgers second-round picks. So he was a fifth-year senior. He was the oldest player, I believe, taken in the top 100 or so picks. And he came out of nowhere in 2020 to have a great season, as short as it was. He had a 51-1 strikeout-to-walk ratio. And some of the changes that I think he's already made with his delivery working with the Dodgers over the past year, high velocity fastball up to 98, good slider. Someone who I think is another sleeper in this system who can get overlooked because of his age, because we weight age and prospect value a little bit more than I think teams used to. He's someone who can maybe be overlooked. Gerardo Carrillo was just added to the 40-man roster this offseason. Smaller, I think he's only about 5'10", 5'11", skinny frame, but he has an electric arm. He's been up into the triple digits. Great slider. A guy who has maybe a starter's mitts, but might not have the command to start. I think he probably ends up in relief, but he has this stuff absolutely for high leverage relief. And if needed, he's on the 40-man roster. We could even see him this year.
Can I pause you there? Because the 40-man roster thing is interesting. You've got Estevez at 19, ranked ahead of two guys on this screen we're looking at who got added to the 40-man roster over him. So how does that, I mean, obviously we're talking about guys of different ages, that kind of thing, but how are you, is this sort of you taking a stand and saying, hey, I know the Dodgers maybe view Carrillo more highly than they view Estevez, or, you know, Uceda, who we're about to get to, more highly than they do Estevez, but I'm going to sort of stand on this hill and say, I think Estevez is the better prospect. Like, how do you process that kind of thing when that news comes out that the Dodgers protect your, you know, number 22 and 27 guys? Obviously your list came out after, but not number 19.
So it in part has to do with, you know, offensive players generally are more valuable than pitchers, specifically relief pitchers. So if there's a chance Omar Estevez is a starting second baseman, which I think there is, I think that the chance that he's a starting second baseman is better than the chance of Gerardo Carrillo, you know, potentially starting long term.
Got it.
And
lower likelihood,
even if he's a bench player,
likelihood, but higher value if the likelihood plays itself out, kind of deal.
Yeah, I think Omar Estevez, there's a decent shot he's a 1 to 2 wins per year guy. And if you're a relief pitcher, that's still pretty hard to do. Yeah. You have to be one of the better relief pitchers to put up 1 to 2 WAR every year. And even if Gerardo Carrillo ends up being a high leverage reliever, that'd be a lot to ask. So again, the differences in those spots, I think it is 19 to 22, very small, not huge differences, but that's the main reason.
Fair. Okay, I cut you off. Robinson Ortiz, number 23. This is a guy that, I'll be honest, I'm not familiar with much of all. There's a lot of names behind him, but Ortiz is not somebody whose name I've come across much at all in just sort of following casually.
Young, stocky lefty, advanced pitchability from what I saw in 2019 at Great Lakes, and he added velocity to his fastball. He was reportedly up to 98 last spring. I haven't heard really much since, but a guy with, you know, as far advanced as his breaking stuff is for his age, you add that fastball in there. I think that this might be someone that people are overlooking. And if he comes out as he was reported last spring, he'll be moving up soon.
And I mean, the only lefty on this list, we kind of touched on this last week. It's 15 of the Dodgers' top 16 pitching prospects on your list are all righties, Ortiz being the lone lefty. Kendall Williams came over in the Stripling trade. What can you tell us about Williams?
So people are going to look at Kendall Williams and see Dustin May because you've got a big 6'6" right-handed starting pitcher drafted out of high school. And not every high school player is going to be Dustin May, not every high school pitcher, even when they're that height. So I don't want to get people's hopes up, but the talent is there. Fastball up to 96. What I liked, at least watching him, he made a spring debut just a couple of days ago, really just manipulating his pitches. He had a little bit of trouble finding the zone, but was able to use his secondary stuff to get out of it, which I liked. Yeah. He showed confidence in his secondary stuff, which you always like to see with a young pitcher.
Yeah, DJ Peters.
DJ Peters been around for a while. He has been a big name since he homered twice off Madison Bumgarner in that rehab start. The same thing, a ton of power. Still, despite his size, athletic enough to play all three outfield positions, major league ready. The consistency has been the issue. He'll go on hot streaks like we saw him at the start of the spring training, but then he'll go on very cold streaks. And so can he tone down the streakiness and become a more consistent player? If he can, I think he's a major league starter.
Yeah, it's interesting. Roberts commented this week that defensively he's further ahead than offensively, which I think is going to surprise most people when they hear it because they see the guy and how far he hits a baseball. But it's exactly what you said. He's like, we trust him anywhere in the outfield. We just can't trust him in the batter's box to put together consistent at-bats time after time, which is interesting. I've got a follow-up on Peters. I'll ask you in a moment, but let's finish out the back half of the top 30. Vogel, Uceda, Galiz, Lewis, and Rosario. What can you tell us about those guys?
Jake Vogel, the Dodgers' third-round pick from this most recent draft, just a true center field speedster. Not a guy who's going to hit for 30 home runs, at least in his current projection, but a guy who can sit at the top of a lineup, being kind of a prototypical leadoff hitter, will play great defense in center field, can maybe steal 30, 35 bases a year. The question is just how far the bat and the approach is going to take him.
Okay. Uceda, another guy who's on the 40-man. Galiz, international free agent from this year. Lewis, second rounder in 2019. And then Rosario's another guy I'm not super familiar with. So I know we're getting towards the end of this 30s, but why don't you run through those four guys pretty quickly, and then I've got some follow-ups.
Yeah, that works. Edwin Uceda. I think I might be a little bit lower on him than the consensus, but I also think he's a reliever, and he doesn't really have the stuff for high leverage relief, which means very likely middle relief or low leverage relief. So I devalue that a little bit. He's smaller framed. He's been successful at AA already, which a lot of the pitchers on this list have not. So if he can keep doing that, I don't think it's out of the question that he continues to start, but I think his most likely outcome is in relief. Jesus Galiz, signed as part of this most recent international free agent class with Lumen Diaz, was originally supposed to go to the Yankees, but because Major League Baseball instituted a new rule, no trading bonus pools during the pandemic, the Yankees couldn't sign him. The Dodgers were able to sign him for probably less than he would otherwise be worth in a normal international free agent signing class. It sucks for him because he had to take less money. But someone who, just another one of these young catchers with upside that the Dodgers have seemingly filled their system with. So he'll be someone to watch very far away, probably 5 or 6 years away, but someone to follow in the coming years. Jimmy Lewis was also a second-round pick from 2019, like Kendall Williams, another big 6'6" right-hander, although Jimmy Lewis happens to be from Texas, where Dustin May is. He's gotten good reviews and instructs, but he didn't pitch at all after he was drafted. He had a shoulder injury that they repaired, and he was supposed to be ready to go last year. Just haven't seen too much of him. So a guy who might be a little bit lower on the consensus, but I'm just kind of waiting to see more from him, either in person or in video. And Yermin Rosario was also signed as part of that Alex Dejesus Diego Cartaya international free agent class. He was Baseball America's Dominican Summer League Pitcher of the Year in 2019. And one of the reporters actually called him the best kept secret in the Dodgers minor league system, someone with advanced pitchability, solid breaking stuff for his age. And the question is just how much velocity is he going to grow into?
Interesting. Well, this is a fascinating group because you look at this and you've got 3 guys who were drafted in the second round in either 2019 or 20. Knack was in 2020, Williams by the Blue Jays in 19, Lewis by the Dodgers in 19. You've got 2 guys who are already on the 40-man roster. You got Vogel, who's a third rounder, Galiz, who is a elite international free agent signing. So there's a lot of sort of, I don't know what the word I'm looking for. There's draft capital sitting here. And there's 2 names that jump out to me. Peters and Lewis, for completely opposite reasons, right? Peters is the guy we know everything about. Lewis is the guy we know nothing about. So I'll start with Lewis. 20 years old, drafted in the second round in 2019. Again, you pointed out, not able to pitch. And then obviously 2020 happened. Is he 29th on this list because there's some doubt about Jimmy Lewis and what he could possibly do? Or is it simply because of a lack of information? Because for a team like the Dodgers, who has done so well with their high draft picks, to have a second rounder, 2 years ago, not even 2 full years ago, on 29th on this list is just interesting to me.
Well, I think it speaks to their depth and how much other guys have moved up. And, if he was at the alt site last year, if you're able to see him, I know he was at Instructs, but I haven't seen any video from there of him at least. So for me, it's the lack of knowledge, lack of information. And also he's already got a shoulder injury on his resume. Right. So, not saying that's going to happen again or he's a giant injury risk, but he's already got that on his resume. So that's just, minor red flag that you add to the profile. And like I said, the system is so deep that in a lot of other systems, I think he'd be a top 20 or so prospect, but just isn't in this system. With DJ Peters, like you mentioned, we know a lot about him. It's just how consistent can he be? Right now, there's a definite question mark of not just whether he can start, but whether he can be consistent enough to provide bench at bats. We know he can play all 3 outfield positions, but can he provide consistent enough at bats to even be a bench player, or will he be kind of moving between AAA and the majors? So that's a question mark. And again, another guy who a year older, he already had an option year used last year. So just makes him tiny bit less valuable.
Yeah, it's so fascinating to look at these lists, right? Because you've got a 19-year-old kid, you've got Vogel, who's a year out of high school, right next to DJ Peters, who's 25 years old, and he's been in the system, for a handful of years already. And so comparing those two, I guess I'll ask this with Peters. Is he not at the major league level simply because of the depth of the Dodger organization? Or do you think that the issues that you're sort of describing, the questions that you have about him, would probably prevent him from serious playing time in a number of organizations around the league?
On different teams, say on a rebuilding team like the Orioles or the Rockies or whoever, yeah, he may have gotten a chance last year if he was on the 40-man roster. With the Dodgers, he didn't because they're so deep, and they're still so deep.
Yeah.
So if he gets a shot, and this is a guy who can go on a hot streak. We've seen this already in spring training, how impressive he's been and how it's been like, oh, well, why hasn't he gotten his shot yet? Because a lot of times those hot streaks are followed by cold streaks where he strikes out 40, 45% of his at-bats. And, you just can't put a guy in the lineup who is doing that and isn't providing much else. So, he is the upside's still there. I don't think that he's going to be an all-star player. I think he can be an everyday player. But he's 25. Yeah. He has yet to make his major league debut, and that's a factor.
Yeah. And they're saying they're expecting him to do it this year, which I think makes a ton of sense. But he's just such a fascinating guy, I think, because of the body type, you just assume that his calling card has to be his hitting. And yet, from all we've heard and even what we've seen in spring training, it feels like defensively, he is more than good enough to play major league center field right now. And so it's so fascinating, right? Like, we put up with plenty of speedy, athletic center fielders who hit like 260 with no power. I shouldn't say plenty, but there are teams that put up with that type of production in center field because it's such an important defensive place. It's similar to shortstop or second base. You say, hey, the guy plays defense. Yeah, so what if he hits 260 with no power or whatever? And yet, because of Peter's size, it almost feels like, and maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong here, it feels like maybe he's held to a higher standard because you look at him and say, you should be able to put this together offensively, even though defensively you may have already figured some things out. Does that make any sense to you?
I don't know if there's a double standard because he has legitimately struggled offensively at times. When he got promoted to AAA, he started off very hot, went into a cold streak. And the key for him is just toning down the streakiness, more consistent day to day, week to week. And from what I've seen, he's acknowledged that. And look, these guys know what they need to work on. This is their job. This is their profession. This is their dream. So, if anyone was to say to DJ Peters, hey, why have you been so, streaky? He knows that. So I have confidence in him just because he's succeeded at various levels in the minors before when he's been challenged. In a different organization, I think this is someone who could be competing for a starting position out of opening day. He just so happens to be with the Dodgers, who have Mookie Betts and Cody Bellinger and AJ Pollock in their outfield.
Yeah, well, fair. Well, we're not going to put up the rest 31 through 100. You can check out futuredodgers.com for that, but we're not done talking. Before, I've got some rapid fire stuff. Why don't I'll do rapid fire stuff, and then if there are other guys that you want to mention outside the top 30, you can throw those out there. This first one was from T. Roten on Twitter. He says, which pitcher outside of your top 10 can you see making a Pepio-sized leap in your rankings a year from now? And same question with the hitter. We saw Pepio, who jumped, I think from, was he 23 all the way up to the top 5 or 6, I believe. But so who's a pitcher and a hitter that maybe, if you had to pick, might be making that type of leap in the next 12 months?
Pitcher, Andre Jackson, for a lot of what I said earlier, converted position player, still, becoming a pitcher, and the confidence he's shown in his changeup early in spring training is very encouraging. As for a hitter, let's see.
So a guy maybe
I'll say Jake Vogel, because if he hits, this is a potential Gold Glove center fielder and a guy who can steal 30, 40 bases a year. That's really, really valuable if he can.
Fair. Vogel, as soon as I heard his draft profile, I mean, I know everyone says he's already got the best speed in the entire organization, basically. But he just feels like, I like that he's a high school kid. It just feels like there's so much projectability and upside there. And again, if you just bank on, can the Dodgers figure out how to put some power onto this kid? It seems like everything else as far as the God-given stuff he's got. Here's an interesting question for you. This one's one of my own, but 3 years from now, if you find out that there's one guy in your top 100 that you were way too low on, that you had ranked way too low, and he turns out to be a stud, who would you guess that it would be? 3 years from now, a guy in your top 100 that you're too low on.
too low on at this moment,
yeah, at this
or
moment,
you know,
this somebody that 3 years from now you might look back at this list and be like, oh my goodness, I can't believe I had this person ranked, 30 spots worse than he should have been.
are we talking, like a top 30 player,
And
maybe beyond that?
anybody that you want.
I'll go Landon
Okay.
Knack. I think Metlick back in 3, and I like Landon Knack a lot. I was, when you're moving players around, I think 21, like, to me, feels lower than he should be, but based on where the other players are, I felt like that was the right spot. But he's someone who I think maybe that might be too low for him.
Okay. Now the same question, the opposite side, and this one's a little bit harder, but is there a guy, and this probably would need to be someone in the top 20, maybe extended to the top 30, but is there a guy in that group that you're like, you put somewhere, but maybe a little bit begrudgingly, or maybe with a huge sense of, wow, I could be way off. Like this guy could flame out and never materialize into anything. Is there a guy in the top 20, let's say top 30 that sort of fits that bill in your mind? If you find out you were way too high on one player and you turned out to be wrong, who would you guess that it would be?
Clayton Beater, just because the level to which he pitched in the shortened season in 2020, we're talking about, I think, 4 or 5 starts that, he really pitched at like a top 2 rounds level. He was a closer before that, and there are injury issues there. So still some uncertainty with him, but super, super high upside if he can figure it out.
I was going to say that had to hurt you a little bit to say, because I know you are a massive Clayton Beater fan. So that must have hurt a little bit to say out loud.
Yeah, and I hope he succeeds just because he was one of the top guys on my board for the first round last year. And, watching the draft and seeing come to the Dodgers first, second round pick, they don't take him, they don't land in Knack. But I figured, okay, they're going to save some money with Knack. Maybe they'll go get Cole Wilcox, who ended up going to the Padres, or Beater. And they ended up getting Beater. So I was very happy with that.
Love it. Who would you say is your favorite player in the system? One reason or another. Could be any reason that makes sense to you, but who's your favorite player in the system? Top 100. Maybe a guy you just like.
I'll go Michael Busch.
Okay, why Michael Busch?
And I don't think that's an original answer, but the dude just hits fantastic approach, someone who can realistically put up a 15% walk rate in the majors in his prime. And he can do that potentially playing second base, first base, and both corner outfield spots.
Okay, one last question. Outside the top 30, one prospect that you like the most? And not necessarily asking who number 31 is on your list, but if there's a guy outside the top 30 that maybe is ascending to a speed where you say, hey, if this guy was in my top 20 a year from now, I wouldn't be surprised.
I will go with Kyle Hurt, who is one of the prospects the Dodgers got back from the Marlins in the Dylan Floro trade. He's someone who was a top prep player coming out of high school, had some injury issues, had some inconsistencies, ended up going to USC. Again, more injury issues, more inconsistencies, had his best year so far. He has 3 legitimate pitches, a fastball in the mid-90s, a starter's build. So if he shows, what he was showing in the shortened season last year, someone who could very realistically be in the top 30 by midseason.
And where do you have him ranked right now?
I have him at 46.
Okay, 46. There you go. Good stuff. Good stuff. Well, hey, if you haven't checked out his stuff already, futuredodgers.com, definitely get a lowdown, because he's got blurbs for all these guys. He's got the full top 100, so tons of details there. Well, let's shift gears a little bit and move from prospects to spring training. We've got 2 segments we do each week, 3 up, 3 down, stock up, stock down, I should say. Guys that are either ascending or descending that we're seeing in the spring training world. And then the second segment is I'll read you off some quotes or some things that are happening. You tell me big deal or no deal. So let's start with 3 up, 3 down, and stock up and stock down. I don't know why I keep messing up the name of my own segment here, but I went all negative last week. I went 3 stock down guys. I want to give a shout out to AJ Pollock, who went 3 for 3 at one point this week. His average is way up to like $1.50 now. So shout out to AJ Pollock. But I'm going to start off myself and going up with Keibert Ruiz. Keibert Ruiz, 4 for 4 this spring, finally gets to see some spring training action. He has 4 for 4 with a double and 5 RBIs. Roberts had this to say, really impressive. He came to camp ready to go, albeit delayed, but that was out of his control. The way his mindset and outlook on things, the body, the at-bat quality with the pitchers, I'm just really, really pleased with where Keibert is right now. taking that next step forward from being just a prospect to being a big league player. So my first stock up is Keibert Ruiz. Been a really good week or so for him. Who do you got, Justin?
So I will also go stock up, and I'm going to go with Cody Bellinger. And for one reason, he's playing in games. He's healthy. He looks good. And that's basically it. Just the fact that he is ready to go, playing in games, and, in all certainty, or with almost all certainty, will be in the lineup on opening day.
Yeah, and we can talk about his batting stance here in a little bit, but he did come back, and I believe in his second game of the spring, and hit a home run. So that eased some concerns there for sure. My second's a guy that we've been talking a little bit about all spring, but I just have to keep giving a shout out. Stock up Victor Gonzalez. I mean, 6 1/3 this spring, no earned runs, just 1 hit allowed with 8 strikeouts. We keep talking about, are the Dodgers going to have a second relief pitcher in the bullpen? We're going to talk about that in a minute. Is it David Price? But we know who Victor Gonzalez is. The guy has been an absolute beast. You could argue that he's one of the best relief. I think it's clear he's one of the best relief pitchers that the Dodgers have. How high on that list? Is he top 3? Is he top 5? Is interesting. But if this spring is any indication, 1 hit in 6 1/3, remarkable stuff from Victor Gonzalez.
I think he's one of their top 3, without a doubt.
There we go.
So, speaking of lefty relievers, I'm going stock up again with Garrett Clevenger.
Go Ducks.
So, one boost to him, Oregon guy. One boost to him is that Alex Vesia was optioned, which means if the Dodgers are going to carry a second lefty reliever and it's not David Price, it's either him or it's Scott Alexander. And my argument for carrying Clevenger is, what you have with Scott Alexander. You don't know exactly what you have with Garrett Clevenger. And based on what he's shown in spring training, I think it is worth figuring out what you have with him. He's been bumping 95 to 97, or at least he was in his last start, or in his last appearance. We also had Fangraphs, or I don't know where I'm going today. We also had StatCast for his last appearance. And so we were able to see that his fastball rotations per minute, I got that right. I don't know where I'm going with anything today. His fastball rotations per minute was up over 200 RPMs from last year. And Choice Fielder, who, if you don't follow, you should follow him, he noted that fastball spin is something that can stabilize quickly. So even though it's a small sample size, we had 5 last year to work from with StatCast, 11 in his outing the other day. It's something that can stabilize quickly. And with that large of a difference, probably made a change there.
Yeah, well, I'll give you another reason why they should pick him. He's better than Scott Alexander. Alexander is like play to contact. He's just average. He is the definition of a solid but unspectacular reliever. Clevenger has the making of a guy that's going to get swings and misses, throws some heat. So, and I'm not biased here because he's an Oregon guy, although that is a plus in my book. But I'm with you. I had Vesia and Clevenger as kind of a 50-50, and then Vesia got optioned the next day. So to me, Clevenger, I agree with you, is kind of the guy in the mix in the non-David Price left-handed pitching mold. So number 3 for me is our guy, Austin Barnes. I don't know why I say our guy. We've been joking about how he should be the Dodgers' designated hitter a lot, but 9 for 23 in the spring training, 3 doubles and a home run. He's got 5 RBIs, 4 walks. He's got an on-base percentage of .481 and a slug of .652. Austin Barnes, there you go. I will not say a single thing I just said is sustainable from Austin Barnes, but shout out to him for an OPS of about 1,200 so far this spring. Number 3 for you.
And I'll end with another positive. We're going 3 up again. Dustin May has looked phenomenal this spring. He's throwing more 4-seamers, and breaking ball has really improved. He's added some more depth to it. And those are 2 things that I think are going to be very conducive for him striking out more batters, which is one of his main weaknesses in the last couple of seasons. For a guy who throws as hard as he does and has the pure stuff like he does, he hasn't struck out a ton of guys. Those 2 developments, I think, if they continue and if they're real, will allow him to strike out a lot more guys, and he might be able to realize that top of rotation upside start.
Yeah, talk a little bit about the 4-seamer stuff, because I've seen some folks writing about it online that he has historically basically not thrown any 4-seamers, and now he's throwing a bunch of 4-seamers. Is it as simple as just having a pitch that moves so much differently than his 2-seamer, than his breaking stuff? What is sort of the special sauce to why people are excited about him throwing so many 4-seamers?
So he has thrown 4-seamers before in the minor leagues. In the major leagues, he's thrown that turbo sinker a lot. And the reason why 4-seamers are valuable is because Four-seamers miss more bats than two-seamers do. Two-seamers and sinkers. Two-seamers can run into bats. You can get a lot of ground balls with them. You brought up Scott Alexander, primarily sinker guy, gets a ton of ground balls. Doesn't strike out a lot of guys. Brusdar Graterol, another guy who primarily hard-throwing sinker, doesn't strike out a lot of guys, even as good as his stuff is. So four-seamers will miss more bats, and they will especially miss more bats at the top of the zone and just above the zone. And that's where we've seen Dustin May target a lot of his four-seamers. And if you add that to his repertoire where you don't know if a four-seamer is coming at the top of the zone, or you might have one of those turbo sinkers that moves like 1.5 feet, or his breaking ball, which has looked great in spring training. And he's got a cutter too, which, again, I'm glad he's probably going to throw that a little bit less. I don't think that should be in his top 2 pitch offerings, but
just to mix it up.
So very solid fourth pitch.
Love it. Love it. Okay, well, let's shift. It's sort of related to the conversations we've been dancing around. We'll get to big deal, no deal. And the first one I want to give you is David Price. I'll preface with the question, and then I'm going to read you a long quote from David Price. The question is, what do we think about the fact that David Price seems to be lobbying publicly for a bullpen role? So here's a full interaction that he had with the press the other day. Somebody mentioned, hey, you pitched on 3 days rest for relief appearance. Now you started. Are you preparing yourself for any role? He said, quote, I think that's what we're trying to do. If I get my pitches built up to whatever we're trying to do, I do think that's a lot easier to do now as opposed to making appearances out of the bullpen or shorter rest at the beginning of the regular season. If they ask me to start a game, that would be a lot tougher. It's easier to get ramped up now and then taper back a little bit if I'm throwing out of the bullpen as opposed to just working out. So basically he starts off by saying, hey, I'm sort of preparing for anything. They asked, do you envision yourself being a high leverage relief pitcher at some point, pitching back-to-back days? Absolutely, he says. The times that I've thrown out of the bullpen, it's always been on short rest. I feel like the more that I throw, the more crisp my stuff and pitches get. I enjoy having the opportunity to go out there and help this team win as much as I can. I think that's the one thing that's tough about being a starter. You get to play every 5 days. As a reliever, you go to the field, you know you have an opportunity to help the team be successful. That's just kind of my attitude toward being in the bullpen and the way I look at it. He goes on to say, I'll get outs wherever they ask me to. If it's the beginning of the game, the middle, the end, I'm open for all of it. The last question is willingness to take any role similar to the unselfish tone that Mookie Betts set last year. He said, I've never really thought about it. I want my teammates to know I want us to be the best version of the Dodgers that we can be. Whatever that entails me doing, I'm okay with that. I've done this for a long time. I know we have a tremendous amount of talent with our young guys. Those guys deserve opportunities to go out there and be starters. I want those guys to go out there and be successful and build their routine as a starter. They have really, really good stuff, and I want to see those guys be successful. If me going to the bullpen gives those guys more opportunities, I'm all for that. This is so fascinating to hear a guy who is projected as a starting pitcher by just about everyone, seemingly openly, publicly lobbying. And this is not the first time this type of interaction has happened for a spot in the bullpen so that Dustin May and Tony Gonsolin can get shots at the starting rotation. Justin, what is your reaction? Because this is mind-blowing to me.
So are we still playing big deal or no deal?
Big deal or no deal.
Big
deal or no deal that David Price is publicly lobbying for a spot in the bullpen.
I think it is a big deal because you'll hear guys talk about, well, I'm willing to do anything for the team. I'd love to start, but I'll do whatever the team asks. And this is not quite that tone. He's saying like, yeah, I'm down to throw, in the bullpen. I'll come out on back-to-back days. And I think specifically the way he's talked about getting guys like Dustin May and Tony Gonsolin their innings and making sure that they can continue to develop. It's evidence of his character. He's looking out for young guys who have their entire career ahead of them. And yeah, I'd say that's a pretty sizable nugget of news, just because if he is fine with going to the bullpen, it's one less piece to figure out, because before you have 7 legitimate major league starters, maybe even 8 with Jimmy Nelson, who you want to get innings over the course of the year. If he says, yeah, I can go to the bullpen for a couple months, that just gives you more leeway to find innings for those other guys.
Not to mention we're talking about trying to figure out who the second lefty is out of the bullpen. David Price would solve that problem. And, just to be perfectly honest, I love Kenley Jansen. Kenley Jansen has been great this spring, but Price gives you one more guy that you would absolutely trust with the game on the line in a late inning situation, I think. A guy who's been in the biggest moments. So, yes, we know the salary. You kind of have to throw that out as you're doing all the math in this. Yes, paying $17 million a year or half of that or whatever they're paying him for to be a non-closer reliever. Probably doesn't make a ton of sense, but when you factor in May and Gonzalez getting some more opportunities to start, it's definitely interesting. Again, to me, it's just a big deal because of the way that he's going about it. It's not to say that he's doing this underhandedly or that Roberts doesn't know, but he's just open, and you imagine he's having these conversations as well. So a couple more nuggets here. We've got a few more, actually. There's a lot going on. This one's a shorter. Corey Knebel touching 96 miles an hour with his fastball. Roberts was asked if he would be pitching in high leverage situations this year. Absolutely. I think his experience, the stuff, his openness to pitch any inning, I trust him. Big deal or no deal to hear Roberts saying that about a guy like Knebel, who's brand new to the team, has coming off basically not had his best year in 3 years, saying absolutely he's a high leverage guy for us.
Not a big deal, just because I think that was something that was generally assumed before this. I don't think it took Dave Roberts saying that for people to say that he's going to be one of the high leverage guys.
Yeah, and I guess it depends on how big of a group is that, right? Like him saying he's a high leverage guy, does that mean he's one of the top 5 relief pitchers the Dodgers have? Because that's not controversial. But is he saying, he trusts him more than, I don't know, Blake Trinan or something? I believe he actually said he has Trinan ahead, and obviously Jansen's a closer. So maybe Knebel's third in that list. Okay, next one. Dave Roberts non-committal on Zach McKinstry's spot on the opening day roster when asked, and yet Jorge Castillo reports that Roberts says Matt Beaty has earned a spot on the opening day roster. I don't believe Beaty was on your opening day roster projection. So is this a big deal or no deal to you that Matt Beaty has got a spot on the opening day roster?
That is a relatively big deal because I know he's worked more in the outfield, but he's still primarily corner outfielder, can play some first base, can play some third base. Zach McKinstry plays middle infield and can play all over the outfield. So different defensive profiles, and it just changes what you might be able to do late in games if you're only carrying 4 position players on the bench. So if you're carrying 4 on the bench and you're assuming the starting lineup looks, I think what most people assume it is, those 4 guys are Austin Barnes, Gavin Lutz, Edwin Rios, and Matt Beaty. And you don't really have a backup center fielder. Your backup center fielder is probably Chris Taylor, who's in the lineup.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, and again, we're not saying that McKinstry definitely isn't going to make it. I think there's a way to make everybody fit, but I had Beaty behind McKinstry. I had them both making it, but it's just interesting. Not surprising the way I've watched things play out this spring. I kind of assumed it would happen. It's not the decision I would make personally, just because of what I think Matt Beaty's upside really is in the grand scheme of things, but kind of makes sense. This next one to me is maybe the most interesting and fascinating. Dave Roberts, when asked how the playing time would be split between Will Smith and Austin Barnes, with the understanding that there is likely to be no DH in the National League this year. Is it a big deal or no deal that Dave Roberts says Will Smith will probably play something like, quote, something like 90 games this season?
That is a big deal, but it depends on his definition of 90 games. If 90 games means 90 starts at catcher and he'll fill in at third base, he'll pinch hit and come into games that he's not starting in, play somewhere in the infield late in the game so they get his bat in the lineup, that's fine. Save his energy and his stamina for the postseason. Yeah. If it's, 90 games and he might pinch hit every once in a while, but we're probably going to keep him down the other 70, that's a big deal because Will Smith is a top 3 offensive catcher in baseball. And to limit him to just over half of your games played, I don't think would be the most prudent choice. But we know how good Austin Barnes is defensively. We know how much the Dodger pitchers love working with him, and that matters too. Will Smith he might not ever get there, but he's got to get enough playing time to at least develop behind the plate and develop a rapport with all the pitchers.
Yeah, this one's absolutely insane to me. Like, Will Smith he's one of the best catchers in baseball. He's one of the best players in baseball. And yes, I know he plays catcher, and yes, I know Austin Barnes is a person that exists, but to say he's going to play something like 90 games is absolute madness. It'd be like if the Dodgers had, Justin Turner and Edwin Rios had proven himself, and they're just like, well, we have 2 guys, so Justin Turner's only going to play 90 games this year. Like, it's absolute insanity to me. So I'm with you. It feels unlikely that they're going to put Will Smith in the field in those other games because we know how a lot of teams like to deal with. They want to keep their second catcher available, although I guess if he's playing third, maybe he could be shifted back to catcher in an emergency. But, man, I sure as heck hope that does not play out the way that it sounds like it's going to play out. Okay, a couple more here. Clayton Kershaw, velocity hovering around 88, 89 last week. Big deal or no deal to you?
No deal. Still the middle of March. So as long as he's, back, he has been successful at 90 to 93. He doesn't throw 95 anymore, and he doesn't need to. Just if he's in the high 80s in late April, early May, that's worrying. Yeah. If he comes out and he's 88 to 91 in his first start, I still don't think that's a big concern because they're going to take things slow. They're ramping up from a 60-game season to a 100-game season. And the last thing they want is someone getting hurt because they overexerted themselves trying to get back to their prime velocity early on in the season when they just didn't need to. And I don't think Clayton Kershaw will be the guy to do that.
Okay, last one here. This is a Cody Bellinger one I think you're going to get a kick out of. Cody Bellinger has a new stance. He was asked whose idea it was. He said it was his own idea. Who he consulted with, he said, I consulted with myself. But here's the question he was asked. Last season, pitchers attacked you with more fastballs. Is the new stance in response to that? Bellinger's response. I actually didn't know that. Big deal or no deal that Cody Bellinger has no idea that he was being attacked with more fastballs last year.
I love Cody Bellinger. What an awesome human being. I saw someone on Twitter discussing how his open stance could allow him to better fend off fastballs up and in, which, kind of beat him a little bit last year, like you said, even if he wasn't super cognizant of it. It's just, he's funny, man. I love having him on my team.
The whole interaction, I mean, I'm reading it in quotes in a transcript of the interaction. It just cracked me up because it was like, who did you consult? And he's like, I don't know, it was my own idea. Like, it was sort of like, and they're asking Dave Roberts, like, hey, why does Cody keep changing his stance exactly? And he's like, well, I don't know, some guy, like, he's got to make sense of this thing that seemingly makes no sense, which is a former MVP award winner is doing everything possible to not go back to exactly what he was doing in that MVP award-winning season. He changes his stance last year, struggles, figures it out in the playoffs, and then he comes back this year with a radically new stance where he's way more open. It seemed like he closed it off a little bit in the second game when he hit the home run, but who knows? The Cody Bellinger deal with his batting stance, I think, is just something Dodger fans better get used to talking about because it just doesn't feel like the type of thing that's going to go away. There were a couple more I was going to throw out here. I think there's some interesting stuff with Urias and his curveball now becoming a slurve. I saw some pitching ninja type stuff about that pitch. People are really excited. And then I thought was interesting too, one other nugget, was Kenley Jansen just being honest about COVID last year. He had COVID and just talking about how it kind of messed him up and how he was never 100% recovered because he had to take 2 weeks off and then he just tried to go from 0 to 60 basically to ramp up. And so, again, I'll say it till I'm blue in the face. Kenley Jansen was better than anybody gives him credit for last year, especially when you look at the metrics of exit velocity and hard contact and all that kind of thing. He's looked fantastic this spring. Who knows what that means? I've predicted an ERA under 3. That was one of my bold predictions for 2021. So I'm high on Kenley Jansen. I think COVID messed up a bunch of people last year, and surely people that definitely got it, like Kenley Jansen, would be in that category as well. So, but that's it. We're at an hour on the show. So we appreciate all you guys joining us. Justin, thanks for coming on. We're hoping to have you on throughout the regular season. But hey, again, if you guys have not checked out his stuff, futuredodgers.com, top 100 list. He's got a opening day roster prediction in there as well. Any other stuff? Are you doing any more opening day roster stuff between now and April 1st?
Probably just minor updates. Like I might take a look at the Matt Beatty situation and make a switch there, but nothing major.
Okay. Well, Justin, we appreciate you joining us. Follow him at Future Dodgers on Twitter. Are you on social media anywhere else?
Just at Future Dodgers.
Okay, at Future Dodgers on social media. We appreciate you joining us. Again, this is DodgerHeads presented by DodgerBlue.com. Check out DodgerBlue.com for all the latest news. DodgerBlue1958 on social media everywhere. And again, we appreciate you watching. Subscribe to the YouTube channel. Click the notification bell. Once the regular season gets going, we're probably going to have 2 live shows, or I should say 1 post-game show and 1 recorded show a week, plus the live or the mini updates throughout the week. So we appreciate you joining us. We will see you next week.
The best team holding a trophy high in the air. The Los Angeles Dodgers, champions of the baseball world.